Well, ladies and gents, welcome to CG Reaction, and this is every country England has invaded, visualized by the channel Real Life Lore. So this is basically video about English colonization of lots of countries. I'm sure there's going to be tons of it. I don't think there has ever been an empire that was so successful and widespread as a English empire, British empire. So, first of all, why England was so successful as colonizing every place and not some other country? I think the first thing goes to my mind is their taxing system. What they did was they colonized some place, they tax that place heavily so it doesn't become burden on the empire, and they even get money out of it, so it was fruitful, so it gave incentive to colonize next place. And obviously the places can be taxed upon, or get natural resources from it, so basically pays it for itself and even more. So that just gave more incentive, more drive to colonize more places. And so nobody in the past thought of doing that, and they did. So sometimes I even wonder, did Britain even locally made something, or did they just colonize other places and took resources from that and became rich? That is I always wondered that. And major thing was that why was it capable of doing that? Everybody knows British Navy. British Navy is immensely powerful, the most powerful. I don't know about today, but most of the history, British Navy has been extraordinarily more powerful than any other navy. So basically most area on the planet is water, and if you're dominant on the water, you can basically just take ships and go to the far distance places and dominate them, and nobody can do anything about it. You can basically dictate which trade routes to be more fruitful and which trade routes to cut off. So you can just starve some people into submission. You have lots of power if you control the sea. Basically that's the point. So their navy was immensely powerful. Their taxing tactics was fruitful to them. So basically morale of the British people was high since they were becoming rich. Also they had this pioneering thing, like we are colonizing more places than anything, we're bringing civilization to the places, things like that. So basically they dominated, I guess, more than half of the world, if not more. I'm pretty sure most countries that I can even think of, England at some point has colonized them. So that's just massive thing. There are lots of countries that has Independence Day, and almost all of them celebrate the Independence Day from England. That's how much England colonized people. So yeah. And people, remember, if you like my reaction, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to see other reaction that I did, check out the description. There's a playlist with all of my video in it. Check the end cards, and just like I say, hit like and hit subscribe, and comment down if you want to react to some other video. Now let's watch this one.
This video is made possible by CuriosityStream. Watch all of my videos early and ad-free, or watch my upcoming original series exclusively on Nebula, which you can get access to for $15 a year through the bundled deal at curiositystream.com/reallifelore. For a good chunk of the past few centuries, this music was the final boss music played for people across the entire world. The English and later the British have been responsible for invading and conquering more countries and people than any other nation in human history. And honestly, it's startling just how many places they've been to. In this video, I'm going to do my best at attempting to visualize all of Britain's invasions and conquests for you, continent by continent, in as brief a time as possible. So let's begin with the closest continent to Britain, Europe. Ireland was the first target of British conquests and was invaded as early as
What's stunning to me is, I know up until Romans, like Roman civilization, up until then British were nothing, English were nothing, Roman was dominating English people, Romans were that powerful. But between that and just recent, like past few centuries where Britain was so dominant, I want to learn about the history, about some good video. If you know it, just comment down that how did it Britain England became that powerful? How did their navy became that powerful? Is it the Romans, they left behind some heritage or something that just passed on to them or something? How did the British became so powerful like that? Because during the Romans time they were not. in the past few centuries, they're suddenly in the history like they are so powerful. What happened in the between? That's a blank to me. I don't know what happened.
1169. Within 400 years of gradual conquests, the entire island was ruled by the British and remained that way until most of it was granted independence in 1921. Historically, France has probably been invaded by the English more times than any other country in the world. Just take a look at this huge list of invasions. There's not even enough time to talk about a third of these, and for a time, all of this territory inside of modern France was directly controlled by the English, with Calais being the final.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally the neighbor country, literally, it's just there. And during the distance between Calais is like nothing. It's just too small of distance. Obviously, if they're going to invade their closest country first.
Peace that fell in 1557. Well, except for that time when the British took over Corsica for a couple years. The British continue to invade Spain by the millions every winter, but in the past, they've come with a lot less friendly intentions. English and later British soldiers invaded under the Black Prince in 1367 and continued on through the first, second, third, and fourth raids on Cadiz and that time when the British took over Gibraltar and Minorca. They gave Minorca back, but decided on keeping Gibraltar forever.
Yeah, isn't Gibraltar still British colony even today? I think it is.
In recent history, the British have invaded Belgium in order to support the Belgians, but that wasn't always the case. They conducted two pretty large-scale invasions of modern-day Belgium in 1654 and again in 1701, and Flanders itself was ruled by the English for a few years in the 14th century. The Netherlands was one of England's historical arch-rivals, and so there's been plenty of invasions going in this direction across the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1940, the British technically invaded and took over Iceland peacefully for a year in order to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Germans. But this was heavily protested by the Icelandic government at the time, so in my books it still counts as an invasion. Italy, of course, was invaded by the British Army during the Second World War as well in 1943, but there were plenty of invasions before then, dating back to Richard the Lionheart's invasion in 1190. Germany, too, was obviously invaded by the British Army in 1945, and northwestern Germany was occupied by the British for 3 years until 1948. But a lot of German territory was ruled by Britain long before then. The islands of Heligoland were British for most of the 19th century, and
it's just there. It's like walking distance, isn't it? I know it's not. I'm just making a joke. Chill out.
The Kingdom of Hanover was effectively ruled under a personal union for over a century between 1714 and 1837. Austria was also invaded in 1945, and the southwest of the country was occupied for a decade. Norway was invaded in 1810 and 1812 during the Napoleonic Wars when it was a part of Denmark-Norway because Denmark was aligned to France, so obviously Denmark was invaded during that time as well. Finland, Estonia, and Latvia were all briefly invaded by small units during the Crimean War against Russia because they were all part of the Russian Empire at the time, and of course, Russia itself was invaded then too, as well as in 1918 when the British took over a large chunk of northern Russia for a time in their fight against the Bolsheviks. The territory of modern Ukraine was invaded by British army units during the Crimean War. The British took over the Croatian island of Vis between 1807 and 1814 during their fight against Napoleon. The British army had boots and guns on the ground in Bosnia recently between 1992 and 95 fighting against the Bosnian Serbs.
So during the Napoleonic War, most of the time British could not fight Napoleon head on the land in France. But during that time they invaded lots of French colonies too because they were really dominant navy, and France can do nothing about it since they were not as dominant as Britain.
And around the same time, the RAF also carried out bombing strikes against Serbian Serb targets in Serbia in 1999. Montenegro was briefly blockaded and invaded in 1913 during the First Balkan War. The British owned the westernmost Ionian islands of Greece between 1815 and 1863 before they gave them back, while Bulgaria was invaded and almost entirely occupied by the British Army between 1918 and 1919 at the end of World War I. Cyprus was a British protectorate between 1878 and 1914 when they decided to just outright annex it to piss off the Turks, and it remained annexed until 1960, except for two small chunks that are still British today. Turkey itself was massively invaded by the British during World War I, and part of it was occupied between 1919 and 1923. That wraps up Europe, so let's move on to Asia next. Modern-day Israel and Palestine, as well as Jordan, were British-controlled from the end of World War I to 1948 and 1946 respectively. Lebanon and Syria were both occupied from the Vichy French government briefly during World War II. Iraq was ruled between 1919 and 1932 and invaded again during the Second World War and again in 1991 and again in 2003. Kuwait was a colony for over 60 years until 1966.
Does 2003 even count? I mean, lots of country was invading Iraq at that time.
Georgia and Azerbaijan were both invaded and occupied right at the end of World War I for a year. Iran has been invaded at least 3 times, with the most notable example being the joint Anglo-Soviet invasion of 1941. Turkmenistan was invaded in 1918 to prevent Bolshevik influence from spreading any further. Afghanistan is a favorite British invasion spot since it's been invaded in 1839, 1878, 1919, and again in 2001. Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman
2014, isn't that? No, that's not the way. Is that the one where Top Gear made an episode about how they were pulling out all the equipments? Was that the Iraq? I don't know. But yeah, can you really count Iraq and Afghanistan's 21st century invasions, because other countries were invading too at the time?
Were all controlled by the British until the early 1970s, while a chunk of Yemen was controlled for over a century between 1839 and 1967. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka were all, of course, invaded many times and outright ruled by the British Empire in parts for nearly...
Yeah, all of this was India. The British came and in the end let's just put cracks in it. And there you go, we have Pakistan, Bangladesh and India, separate things now. 1947, all of them.
2 centuries between 1757 and 1947. Nepal was invaded in 1814 but never successfully conquered. Bhutan was invaded in 1772 and again...
I mean, Nepal is basically on the hills and lots of mountains, so they're like, why bother? I think that's what they did, since they had lots of colonies at the time.
In 1864 and was sort of conquered as a protectorate between 1910 and 1948. Burma/Myanmar was invaded in 1826 and was definitely successfully conquered and ruled through 1947. Thailand was briefly invaded in 1945 since they were allied to Japan in World War II, and so was Vietnam in the same year, but that was to support the French government against the growing independence movement. Malaysia and Singapore were each conquered and ruled up until the 1950s and 1960s. Brunei was conquered and ruled up until the 1980s, whereas the Philippines were briefly invaded during the 7 Years' War. China got invaded a lot, and Hong Kong was a colony until as recently as 1997.
Yeah, that surprised me. I think I saw that in Rush Hour movie. Like, Hong Kong I think it was Rush Hour movie where there was a plot line where something about British being in power up until 97, then, giving away the power to Chinese. I'm like, goddamn, 97? Hong Kong was under British power until 1997? That's a long, long time, man.
And while not outright invaded, part of Japan was occupied following World War II between 1946 and 1952. And finally...
So basically lots of countries either were invaded because of, French connection or, Russian connections, or because of the World War II's Germany connections. So basically lots of these countries are invaded because they were connected to some other European countries, were European colonies, so they had to attack it. India is basically just like Dutch did it before, for spices and things, for resources.
Indonesia was invaded a bunch during the Napoleonic Wars since it was a Dutch colony along with France
Napoleonic
at the
Wars.
time. Next up, Oceania. Australia and New Zealand, of course, were invaded by the British and established as colonies that each gained independence in 1931. Papua New Guinea...
Australia had their natives, sure, but that's what basically one of those things where the first time in a long time somebody from outside of Australia came to, and that was the British, I guess. Aborigines, as they call the natives, just like in USA there were natives, like native Indians or whatever they're called, that just like that Australia had Aborigines or something like that. So basically Britain was just colonized Australia, and mistakenly people think that it was just filled with all the convicts. No, it wasn't. Convicts were sent there to help around the people. Non-convicts also went there to colonize it, and convicts were there to help them.
was also a British colony for a time, as were the island countries of Fiji, Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. Let's move back over to Africa next, which the British have violently visited a lot. In terms of just places the British outright colonized after invasions, there's the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, along with parts of modern-day Somalia and Guinea. Senegal was briefly invaded and had some of their coastline taken over in the 1700s, while during the Second World War, the British invaded the French colonies of Djibouti, Madagascar, and Comoros after they aligned themselves with the Nazi Vichy regime, and the Italian colonies of Libya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, although they had also invaded Ethiopia much earlier in 1868. And as German colonies right before World War I, the British also invaded Togo and Cameroon without annexing them afterwards. For the final area of the world left to discuss, let's move over to the Americas. All of Canada was a British colony until 1931, while Newfoundland remained until 1949. The United States, of course, was a colony until 1776, and was invaded again in 1812.
It's surprising to me how, British basically arrived at, Northern America, entire Canada and USA, and, made them their own colony. USA claimed independence, but Canada didn't. Why is that? I thought, USA claiming independence, Canada is just basically being there at the same place. Entire Northern America was under, British rule. So if United States claim independence, why didn't Canada go like, yeah, we are claiming independence too. We are with United States or something like that. Why did they stay British colony? I didn't understand that one.
And the modern states of Oregon and Washington were claimed right up until 1846. As far as other outright British colonies here go, there was the Bahamas, Jamaica, Belize, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, St. Lucia, Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana. Besides colonies, Cuba was invaded and occupied during the 7 Years' War in 1762. Haiti was invaded in 1793 during the French Revolutionary Wars. The Dominican Republic was invaded way back in 1655 in an attempt at conquest under Oliver Cromwell. Parts of the east coast of Honduras and Nicaragua were conquered and ruled for nearly 2 centuries until 1819. They sent the Navy to invade Mexico in 1861 to force them to repay some debts, and during the splendidly named War of Jenkins' Year, aka the more lame-sounding War of the Austrian Succession, the British invaded a lot of Spain's colonies, including Panama, a huge one into Colombia, and ultimately Peru. In 1796, the British took over Suriname because it was a Dutch colony, and they were allied with the revolutionary French and later Napoleon. They also invaded Martinique and Guadeloupe because they actually were French during the Napoleonic Wars. Venezuela was invaded in 1902 as part of the so-called Venezuela crisis to force the country to repay some debts they had defaulted on, kind of like Mexico, while Argentina and Uruguay were both invaded during the Napoleonic Wars as well in 1806 when Spain and her colonies were still allied with Napoleon. And that pretty much...
Lots and lots of countries were invaded because of Napoleon, I think. Because France and Napoleon, lots of countries that were either allied to Napoleon or was directly under Napoleon French countries, they were all invaded by British. So British basically like, yeah, if we can't go head to head with you on the, France on the land, we are going to invade every single country that you have around the world because we have a stronger navy.
Sums up all of the territory the British have ever ruled and all of the countries this small island has ever invaded. There are a total of 65 countries today who celebrate their independence days from the British Empire. The empire used to rule over a quarter of all the world's land at the same time and was the biggest empire in human history. And in total, today, there have been 117 modern countries that have been aggressively invaded by the British armed forces during some point in their histories, representing a total of 60% of all the world's nations, which is almost the same number of countries that you can watch this video in. YouTube is available in
117 countries, god damn, 60% of all countries. Look at that, look at the red signs there, god damn. That is just stupid. That's most of Asia, most of Russia, Austria, lots of Africa, lots of Europe, America, so with Northern America. So basically lots of, majority of those countries were either because of Napoleon, France, or because of Germany of World War II. There's somewhat friction to Russia, because of World War II, Japan. India is there, invaded India because of resources, obviously, all those, spices and things like that. This is ridiculous. Look at the scale of it. I mean, there has been dictators in the past that wanted to conquer the world, but they really couldn't. They couldn't even come close to conquering the world. They barely conquered something. Genghis Khan and lots of other, Alexander the Great. I mean, they did conquer, but nowhere near the entire world. Only I can't say one dictator because it wasn't one. But if I were to give a country, that is one country like England, British Empire is the only empire that ever came close to conquering most of the world. Look at the rate signs there. I mean, I like to think if there were no World War One or World War Two, and there haven't been that massive scale of war, and people weren't depleted of resources, I don't know, British maybe slowly would have taken lots of places in the world. That is ridiculous. Alright people, if you like my reaction, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out the description for more video, or check out the end cards. I'll see you next time.